Hey, we have a very special guest that we've known this gentleman for many years. He's a pillar in the cartoon community, and he's just an all-around really great guy.
And he is also in the cartoon industry. This is Mark McCray. Hello, Mark.
Hi. How you doing?
We're great. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to your awesome podcast. Looking forward to talking about cartoons.
So, Mark, give us some background. What started your love for cartoons? I mean, we were kids growing up many decades ago when Saturday mornings were known as the time for cartoons. That's before the 80s when they started putting them on at different time periods. Early on, it was Saturday morning. That's all we did was have cereal, cartoons, and we look forward to it all week. But you took it to the point where it wasn't just part of your childhood, but it was a continuing passion. But give us an idea of what it was like early on for you.
All right. Well, early on for me, one of the things I like to always mention to people is that, back in those days, there was probably most households only had one television set. And most of the time, adults controlled the television sets. But I got lucky in my household. I had 3 brothers, and none of them were interested in watching Saturday morning. So I had the television all to myself. And my dad worked nights, so he wasn't getting up early to watch TV. My mom worked weekends. And so it was an ideal situation for me. But I think I really didn't know the difference between cartoons I watched during the week or cartoons I watched on Saturday morning until one day I thought I was watching a Superman cartoon, and it turned out to be a Justice League of America cartoon. And I was just blown away because it was my first introduction to the DC universe. The cartoon featured Superman, Flash, Hawkman, the Atom, and Green Lantern. And then the same year, on the same network, Space Ghost had crossover adventures with the other Hanna-Barbera stars, which included the Herculoids and Shazam the Genie. And I just, took notice of these new cartoons doing interesting things that I didn't really expect as a viewer. And those shows actually pulled me in, and I got really excited to watch Saturday morning every week just to see what other surprises might happen. So that was my start. But then later down the line, I met a guy at day camp, this kid, his name was Gerald. And Gerald knew everything about cartoons and comics, and he was able to predict what studios would make the following year. He was that in tune with the industry. And I always refer to this kid as my Yoda because he was the one that really made me look at Saturday morning cartoons as well as players like Filmation and Hanna-Barbera and the Pat Freeling and Sid and Marty Krofft and Rankin Bass in a whole new different way.
Now, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the Bronx, New York.
Okay, so I'm from the Northeast as well. And so we had a variety of channels to choose from. Did you do the same thing that I did? Did you keep jumping up and flipping back and forth sometimes because you were frustrated because 2 cartoons were on at the same time that you liked, so you tried to kind of catch some in between commercials?
Oh, it was so frustrating. And I'm like, why would they put, as a kid, you don't understand programming strategy, and you're thinking, why would they pit 2 of my favorite cartoons against each other?
And also it was at a time when we didn't have remote controls, so you had to get up and change the channel on the TV.
Right. And sometimes, in the old days of television, your television choices also depended on which networks came in the clearest on, through the broadcast signal. Like I remember CBS and ABC being pretty crystal clear, and NBC not so much, so sometimes that determined what I watched.
That's true. Very true. Now, one of the things that was very much in our household, and I know it was common throughout so many other households as well, was eating cereal while you were watching Saturday morning cartoons.
Oh, it was like the absolute routine at my house for sure. Because cereal is one of those breakfast choices that even if you're a little kid, it's something easy to make and prepare. You don't have to cook anything. You don't have to go near the stove. And it's easy and simple. And my favorite cereal was Sugar Frosted Flakes. And I watched the documentary not too long ago on breakfast cereals. And I think back in the day, Frosted Flakes had something like 25 to 30% sugar in the cereal. You know, I think these days it's about 10%. But, I mean, you know, I knew that the taste had changed a little bit, you know, from the time I was a kid till now. But I understand what the difference was. Less sugar. But when you're a kid, you know, sugar is like you want as much sugar as you can get, you know. So it was just great. I just loved Frosted Flakes.
I loved it too, and you know, it like I wasn't really like you don't really know like that it even has sugar. You're just like, oh, this tastes good, yeah.
And I like the ads that went along with it, because when we were watching Saturday morning cartoons, you were barraged with cereal ads.
Yes. So Kellogg's was a major sponsor of Saturday morning cartoons. In fact, one of the things that I talk about in my book is that one of the shows that actually started Saturday morning as a competitive business was the Filmation production, The New Adventures of Superman. That series brought in huge ratings, bigger ratings than anyone had ever seen before on Saturday morning. And, of course, it brought in a huge audience and created, you know, what they call in television, what every television network wants, the halo effect, where it's not only stuck around for Superman, they stuck around to watch the whole schedule. And the sponsors came knocking as well. So prior to Superman's success, sponsors like Kellogg's wouldn't touch an action superhero show on Saturday morning simply because the audience was not there. You know, a sponsor wants to put their product behind a show that's going to get great ratings. And Superman was one of the shows that really introduced or brought in the sponsorships to Saturday morning. And of course, with sponsorships, the revenue came in as well.
And that is something that we remember too, all the commercials and things that we wanted to ask our parents to buy for us.
Right. Yeah, well, interestingly enough, that's still the case. Although between like the late 60s, early 70s, the FCC put in rules about some of the commercial content. For example, like all the networks, all the broadcast networks, as well as cable networks, have to let viewers know that they are going from content into the commercial break. And when the commercial break is over, they have to remind viewers that they're going back into the actual content. But for a long time, that rule did not exist. And it was pretty much created so that because the feeling was that kids couldn't tell the difference between content and what the commercial breaks were. The other rule that they developed, for example, if we're airing an episode of Scooby-Doo, for example, you cannot have a Scooby-Doo toy or product featured in the actual Scooby-Doo episode. And these rules are still in effect today.
Help us to clarify, during the 1980s, didn't the rules change a little bit so that they could put on cartoons in the afternoons and then tie in toy ads with the cartoon, such as G.I. Joe, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, things like that?
Right, yes. So in the early 80s, the FCC loosened or relaxed the rules. And so a show like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe or G.I. Joe or Transformers could exist as a show. If He-Man and the Masters of the Universe or G.I. Joe had come out as a series back in 1969 or 1970, it would be considered a 30-second advertisement. But with the FCC relaxing its rules, a series like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe could still flourish. However, they still were not allowed to show He-Man and the Masters of the Universe commercial in He-Man. They could show that. They can show a He-Man commercial in G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe could show He-Man commercial, and He-Man can show a G.I. Joe commercial, but the rules were that it's a rule called KidVid, and that rule was still in effect, but the rules were relaxed enough for a show like He-Man to be considered content and not a 30-minute commercial ad. Yeah, in fact, there was a 1969 series, Hot Wheels series, actually. It was pretty good. It never really promoted the toy line. It was about a group of teenagers that resembled a lot of the kids that you might see on Scooby-Doo. And they raced cars. And they also talked about car safety and following the rules of the road. It was a pretty good show. And Mattel's rival, one of their toy rivals, went to the FCC and complained that Hot Wheels was a 30-minute commercial, and the network was pressured to take Hot Wheels off the air, mainly because a competitor complained about it. And so you didn't see a show, any type of what they call a toy show, again, until the FCC relaxed the rules in the early 80s. And, I just think that I feel like the FCC should continue to relax the rules, because I think kids these days that are teaching their parents how to use their iPhones, I think those kids know the difference between content and a commercial break. And I don't think that those kids need to be told that they know the difference. But it would take the industry, and that would be Cartoon Network, Disney, Nickelodeon. They would need to send someone to Washington to lobby for that law to be relaxed. I think for kids that are maybe, preschool age, I think that the rules should probably be in effect, because they're just learning how to watch television or learning how to watch streaming or whatever the case might be. But I think the older kids on the spectrum of pushing 11 to 12 or becoming teenagers, I think for those kids and whatever programming or content that they're watching, I believe those FCC rules should be relaxed for them, because they understand media, they understand streaming, they understand screens, and they also, in some cases, they'll fast forward through the commercials anyway. Yes, so my favorite cartoon, the show that I really feel pushed over the top, was Josie and the Pussycats. And it kind of happened very organically. So this kid, Gerald, that I talked about earlier, he had predicted that the studios were going to go after Josie and the Pussycats, because the Archies and Sabrina the Teenage Witch had been very successful comic to cartoon adaptions, and Josie was part of the Archie family, so it was like a logical choice that comic book would also be turned into a cartoon. But for me, it was a bit of a head scratcher, because, the Archies had the music, Sabrina had the magic, and there was nothing really special about Josie at all. And it was a book primarily targeted to girls, and I just couldn't see anyone wanting to make this comic book into a Saturday morning series. And the big shock for me when I watched the first episode was that Hanna-Barbera decided not to adapt the comic book in its original form. They decided to go in a different direction. So instead of the high school dance and rivalries between two girls, wanting to date someone in particular, Josie and the Pussycats became the wrong kids in the wrong place who rise to the occasion to save the world. And I think one of the smartest things that Hanna-Barbera ever did with this adaptation was to bring in the supervillains. And watching this as a kid, and it was kind of a shock, because I had no idea that Hanna-Barbera was going to take this comic book in this direction. But it was really good. It was surprisingly good, and I was a fan, and I started reading the credits. That's when I found out who Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were. They were the head writer for Josie. I just couldn't stop talking about it. I thought it was the greatest cartoon ever.
So it sounds like so instead of doing it like the Archies or Sabrina, they tried to make it more like the Super Friends, saving the world and having villains.
Exactly. So they brought in villains like Captain Nemo, classic villains. Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. They brought in the Invisible Man, but they, of course, didn't call him that because of copyright issues. But he had his origins in the UK, and they even brought in some James Bond knockoff villains. And the background music was also had some interesting choices. They used a lot of Ted Nichols' background music that he composed for the Herculoids and Johnny Quest to kind of give the show a more psychological edge. And these were elements that you were not seeing in a lot of the other Hanna-Barbera shows. So they definitely wanted to capture the boy audience, because if you think about it, a name like Josie and the Pussycats, it screams girls. And if you're a network programmer, you want to have an equal balance of boys and girls watching your series. The other interesting thing that they did, Josie and the Pussycats, was the music choices also. The Archies was very successful with Bubblegum Rock, but with Josie and the Pussycats, the music was sort of all over the place. There was a little bit of R&B, there was a little blues, country. There were songs that sounded like they could have been sung by the Supremes or the Jackson 5. And so there was some really interesting choices made there as well. And it was such a groundbreaking series for era. It just made me a real cartoon fan, that series.
And we love that theme song.
Yeah, the theme song was actually composed by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera and the other musical director, Hoyt Curtin. And that's another thing I loved about these guys that were producing Saturday morning cartoons. They wore several hats. They had lots of talents. They did voice work. They composed music. And I think that's really cool and interesting because I feel like nowadays you have your animation director and he directs. An animation director making a cartoon today may not necessarily will not necessarily try to be composing music or doing voiceover work. And these guys, they did it all. I mean, the budgets were low, and I guess sometimes everyone had to jump in and do whatever they can to make the series of cartoon a success.
So you said that that's really what caught your attention, of the unique complexities of animated shows, and you've made it a lifelong project of following so many different cartoons to the point where you even wrote a book about it. Can you tell us more about this development?
Okay, yeah. So, I went to school for radio and television communications. I definitely, because of watching cartoons all those years, I wanted to work in the television industry, specifically kids cartoons. And I got a job working at this production company. And I didn't particularly like the job or the position, and I stayed there for 2 years. And then I left and got a regular job that paid double of what the production job paid. But I soon realized that there wasn't any outlet. So I wanted to get back into the television industry, but I wanted to get back, under my own terms. And I decided to start writing about all the shows and influences that made Saturday morning important. Well, I guess I should backtrack a little more. So in 1989, I went out and I visited Lou Scheimer and tried to get a job with Filmation. Didn't have any job for me, any positions or anything, but we spoke for about 2 hours, and he said to me, you seem to know a lot about my company. You know a lot about who my competitors were. And he says, you should try to find a way to get the information out there. So when I flew back home, a little deflated because I didn't get my dream job, I decided to, launch the newsletter. And I decided to send it to everyone and anyone in the industry who touched kids' content. And I talked about the competition between the studios. I talked about the favorite, the shows that I like, reviews of programming that I like, and what it was like growing up watching Saturday morning back in those days. And after a while, the newsletter started to take off. I started actually getting some freelance jobs because people liked what they were reading. But that was the basis of how the newsletter started. And that's how I built up my contacts. That's how I was able to get back into the industry.
And then what happened then?
So I got a job working at Boomerang. I was part of the team that helped launch the Boomerang network. And I was doing, scheduling and planning stunt ideas for Cartoon Network as well. So part of the job of being a programmer is coming up with ideas to get kids to watch your air. So it might be Dexter's Lab, Mad Scientist, his biggest experiments, anything and everything that we can get different ways and strategy to pull kids in, as well as dealing with, ratings and figuring out if a comedy should, lead into an action series or vice versa. And in 2008, I got a call from Warner Brothers. They wanted me to do commentary for the DVD release of Josie and the Pussycat, which was like, I was so perfect for that job. But it was kind of a weird phone call. I felt like the person who called me did it out of a courtesy, did it because someone from Warner Brothers recommended me to do the commentary for Josie and the Pussycat. Someone from Warner Brothers or the production company that was going to do the DVD commentary called me. And, so I told her a little bit about my background. And it was kind of weird. It was a weird phone call. They didn't want to pay for my flight to L.A. They didn't want to pay for my hotel. And, so we spoke. And then there was another phone call, and she tells me, well, we're going to go in a different direction. And I'm like, what direction is that? And he says, well, we're going to talk about Josie from a comic book point of view. And I said to her, I'm like, well, I know the book from a comic book point of view as well as an animated point of view. But for some reason, they just didn't want to use me. And I felt that if I had my book back then, I definitely could have changed the conversation. I could have told, well, check out my website or look at the conventions I've done. I could have used it to definitely change the direction of that conversation. And why having me would be an asset to your DVD commentary. So since that didn't happen, I decided to take all those newsletters that I did years ago that helped get me into the industry and compile those newsletters into a book, and also add up-to-date commentary because those newsletters have been written 20 years ago. And my editor suggested that I do commentary for as many chapters as possible just to, give updates on what has happened to some of the players that I interviewed or some of the people that I knew back in those days, and which I thought was a great idea because it was a way for me to, for example, talk about a show like Two Stupid Dogs that had such a great production team working on that show. And these people would go on to do big shows, like Craig McCracken worked on Two Stupid Dogs, and Seth MacFarlane worked on Two Stupid Dogs. And those are the guys that, Craig McCracken created the Powerpuff Girls, and Seth MacFarlane, of course, created Family Guy. But like all these people got their start on Two Stupid Dogs, which was a show that I reviewed and talked about, which I thought making a change in the industry in terms of director-driven cartoon shows. And I didn't use all of the newsletters because some of the newsletters were things that didn't necessarily relate to television. They were more comic book based. So we want to keep mostly just the television Saturday morning aspects of the newsletters in the book, and that's how it all came together.
Now, we love the book. It's quite a fascinating look at different things about cartoons that the average person wouldn't think about, and there are so many connections on the inside. So that book is available continuously. Am I correct in saying that it's still available to the public?
Yes, it's available on my website, thebestsaturdaysofourlives.com. Or if you don't want to type in all of that, just type in the initials of the book, which is, the initials are TBSOOL.com. And that'll take you to my website, and you can order your book, and I can send whoever orders any books a signed copy.
That's awesome. And we see you at quite a bit of conventions as well. So I know you make public appearances. What are some of the best experiences that you've had with meeting your fans at conventions?
Some of the best experience has been just connecting with young and up-and-coming fans. I met this kid at a convention, and it was just like talking to myself in the past. It was so weird. I mean, this kid knew a lot about Saturday morning and cartoons, and like, he was 15 years old, and his mom told me, well, he spends a lot of time on Wikipedia. But it was almost like talking to the son I never had. We were just talking and talking about shows that we liked and shows that we wish weren't canceled, and it was a real wonderful experience, just talking to him, and just talking to fans in general at the conventions about some of the shows that they like. Even, sometimes people just want to talk about their favorite Saturday morning cartoons because it definitely brings back a certain memory for them. Or a parent will come up with their kid and to my book and say, see, that's what it was all about. It was about Saturday morning cartoons, and explain to that kid in front of me how Saturday morning was a destination for kids, and you got up early and you had your cereal and you were in your pajamas and you watched your favorite cartoons. And if you missed it because there wasn't any plays, there wasn't any streaming services, no Hulu, no Netflix, and you had to be there to watch all the excitement on Saturday morning. And, I think it's important that your generations understand like how important it was. And the other bigger story about Saturday morning is the fact that Saturday morning is really the proving ground for what would become the 24-hour kid network. If networks had never made revenue off of Saturday morning programming, I think the Kid 24-Hour Network would have been a harder sell when a lot of those type of networks started back in the day.
That's awesome.
Well, Mark, we really appreciate you spending time with us, helping us reminisce about the best Saturdays of our lives. We bought your book. We ended up buying numerous copies to give them out as gifts. And so we look forward to keep connecting with you at conventions. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed talking to you both about the best Saturdays of our lives.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.